The silent caller. It was the first time Sarah had been left alone in the house overnight. Her parents had gone out of town for a weekend anniversary trip, leaving her with a fully stocked fridge, a list of emergency contacts, and the usual warnings to lock the doors and stay safe. At 17, she was more than capable of taking care of herself, and besides, the house was in a quiet, suburban neighborhood. Nothing ever happened in Wood Creek. The house was large, a two-story colonial-style home at the edge of the woods, with neighbors spaced far enough apart to offer privacy but close enough for comfort. Sarah loved the house, especially in the daytime when the light streamed through the tall windows and the rooms felt airy and bright. But as night crept in, the wide spaces seemed to swallow a sound, leaving an eerie quiet that settled over everything like a heavy blanket. Sarah planned to spend the evening binge-watching horror movies in the living room, reveling in the fact that for once, she had the place to herself. She ordered pizza, grabbed a blanket, and settled on the couch, the only light in the room coming from the TV. The first movie was campy, full of jump scares that made her laugh more than scream. But as the second film began, the feeling of being alone started to gnaw at her. It was a slasher movie, the kind where a killer stalks a young woman in her house. The familiar setup felt a little too close to home, and she found herself glancing nervously at the windows, which reflected the glow of the TV but offered no view of the darkness beyond. Halfway through the movie, the landline phone rang. Sarah jumped. No one ever called the landline anymore. Her parents used their cell phones, and so did everyone else. The only people who ever used it were telemarketers or the occasional wrong number. But at 10:30 p.m., who would be calling? She paused the movie and stared at the phone, willing it to stop. It didn't. With a sigh, Sarah stood and crossed the room. She picked up the receiver, her voice hesitant. "Hello?" There was a pause on the other end, followed by a soft, rhythmic breathing. "Hello?" she said again, more firmly this time. The breathing continued, slow and steady. Then, without warning, the caller hung up. Sarah frowned, staring at the phone as if it could offer her an explanation. She told herself it was just a prank, some kids messing around, trying to freak her out. She hung up the phone and returned to the couch, but the unsettling feeling lingered. She pressed play on the movie, but her mind was no longer on the story. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside, made her heart race. The house, which had felt so familiar, now seemed vast and foreign, as though it could hide anything, or anyone. An hour passed, and Sarah began to relax again. The phone call had been a fluke, she told herself, nothing more. She stretched out on the couch, pulling the blanket tighter around her, when the landline rang again. Her stomach dropped. She stared at the phone, the shrill ring filling the silent house. This time, she didn't rush to answer it. Instead, she let it ring. She counted 5, 6, 7 rings before it finally stopped. A tense silence followed, and Sarah sat frozen, her eyes fixed on the phone. A few minutes passed. She considered calling her parents, but she didn't want to worry them over what was probably just a prank. She grabbed her phone instead and texted her best friend, Jenna, telling her about the strange calls. Jenna replied quickly, "That's creepy. Want me to come over?" Sarah hesitated. It was late, and Jenna lived a few blocks away. Besides, she didn't want to seem like a baby. She texted back, "Nah, I'm probably overreacting. I'll be fine, thanks though." Jenna sent a thumbs up emoji, and Sarah set her phone down, trying to shake off the lingering anxiety. Then, the phone rang again. This time, Sarah's heart raced. Something was wrong. She walked over to the phone slowly, as if approaching a wild animal. She picked up the receiver, her hand trembling slightly. "Hello?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The breathing was back, slow, deliberate, and unsettling. Sarah felt her skin crawl. Then, a voice, low and raspy, spoke. "I'm in the house." Sarah's blood ran cold. She stood there, paralyzed, the phone clutched in her hand as the words echoed in her mind. "I'm in the house." She slammed the phone down, her heart pounding in her ears. This couldn't be happening. It was a joke, it had to be. But the voice had been too real, too deliberate. Suddenly, every shadow seemed to move, every creak of the house a sign of something lurking just out of sight. Sarah backed away from the phone, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She grabbed her cell phone and dialed 911, her fingers shaking. 911, "What's your emergency?" came the calm voice on the other end. "There's someone in my house," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. She glanced around the room, her eyes wide with fear. "They called me and said they were inside." The operator remained calm. "Are you in a safe place right now?" "I'm in the living room," Sarah stammered. "I don't know where they are. Stay on the line with me. Lock yourself in a room if you can. Officers are on their way." Sarah nodded, even though the operator couldn't see her. She turned toward the staircase, intending to run up to her bedroom and lock the door, when she heard a soft thud from the kitchen. She froze. It was the sound of something heavy being set down on the hardwood floor, just beyond the living room doorway. Her breath caught in her throat as she backed up slowly, her eyes fixed on the darkened kitchen. The light from the living room barely reached the doorway, leaving the kitchen in shadow. "I think they're in the kitchen," she whispered into the phone. "Stay calm," the operator said. "Officers are only a few minutes away. Can you move to a safer location?" Sarah nodded again, though her legs felt like they were made of lead. She took one step toward the staircase, then another, keeping her eyes on the doorway. A shadow moved. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but Sarah saw it, a shift in the darkness, as if something, or someone, was just inside the kitchen, watching her. She turned and bolted up the stairs, her feet barely touching the steps as she fled to her bedroom. She slammed the door behind her and locked it, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "I'm in my room," she whispered into the phone, her voice trembling. "Good, stay there. The officers should be arriving any moment now." Sarah crouched beside her bed, clutching her phone to her chest. The house was silent again, but it was the kind of silence that felt wrong, too heavy, too oppressive. A sudden knock echoed through the house, loud and insistent. Sarah's heart leapt into her throat. Was it the police? Or was it them? She hesitated, listening. "Sarah," came a voice from downstairs. "It's the police. You can come out now." She didn't move. Something about the voice didn't sound right. It was too calm, too casual. "Sarah, we know you're up there. It's safe now. Come on out." Her grip tightened on the phone. "They're here," she whispered, barely audible. But the operator's next words turned her blood to ice. "Mom, the officers haven't arrived yet. Stay where you are." The knock came again, harder this time, and the voice that followed was no longer pretending. "Sarah, open the door." Terror gripped her as she backed further into the corner of the room, her mind racing. She could hear heavy and deliberate footsteps coming up the stairs now. The door to her room rattled as the handle turned, but the lock held firm. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. The person on the other side of the door pounded harder, the wood shaking under the force. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the pounding stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The footsteps retreated, growing softer until they disappeared altogether. A few minutes later, the red and blue lights of the police cars flashed through her bedroom window. Sarah ran downstairs as officers stormed the house, their guns drawn. But when they searched the home, they found nothing, no sign of forced entry, no trace of anyone. But on the kitchen floor, they found a large, muddy footprint. And on the landline, the last call had come from inside the house. The officers swept through the house room by room, their flashlights cutting through the shadows. Sarah followed, her heart still pounding in her chest, every nerve on edge as they searched for any trace of the intruder. They moved cautiously but with a confidence that suggested this was just routine. After what felt like hours, one of the officers finally turned to Sarah. "We didn't find anyone," he said, frowning. "No sign of forced entry either. Are you sure you didn't imagine hearing someone inside?" Sarah opened her mouth to respond when one of the officers by the landline spoke up. "Sir," he said, his voice tight with concern, "the last call she received, it came from inside the house." The air seemed to freeze around her. Sarah's legs wobbled as the weight of his words sank in. She stared at the phone, dread coiling in the pit of her stomach. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, and Sarah could see the shift in their demeanor. This was no longer routine. "I need you to stay calm," the lead officer said, his voice measured but serious. "We're going to check the basement and attic." One officer led Sarah to the front porch, where she could watch the driveway. She stood there, watching the blue and red lights flicker through the night. The house, now lit up by the police cars, felt like a different place. Cold. Ominous. The shadows that once comforted her had now become places to hide. She scanned the woods beyond the driveway, half expecting to see movement among the trees. But everything was still. A scream from inside shattered the quiet. Sarah whipped around just in time to see the officer from the basement stumble out of the house, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. He was gripping his walkie-talkie like it was a lifeline. The others rushed to him, and he gestured wildly toward the basement door. There's a room. It's hidden behind the furnace. Someone's been living down there." The words hit Sarah like a hammer. The feeling of being watched, the breathing on the phone, the strange noises, it all made sense now. Someone had been living in her house for who knows how long, slipping in and out of the rooms when no one was looking. But that wasn't the worst part. The officers carefully descended back into the basement, and after what seemed like an eternity, they emerged with grim expressions. They were carrying something, a small, tattered notebook. One of the officers approached Sarah, holding the notebook out to her. "You should see this," he said, his voice quiet. Her hands shook as she took it from him. The cover was dirty and worn, and inside, the pages were filled with sketches of her. Some were simple, drawings of her sitting in the living room or brushing her hair in the bathroom. But others were disturbing. Detailed sketches of her sleeping, her in the shower, her eating dinner, with the shadow of the artist looming in the background. Each sketch was dated, and they went back months. Whoever had been living in her house had been watching her for a long time, moving unseen through the walls and the attic, slipping in and out without her ever noticing. She flipped to the last page and felt her breath hitch. The final drawing was of her, sitting on the couch in the living room, talking on the phone. Below it, in shaky handwriting, were 3 chilling words: "I'm still here." Sarah dropped the notebook, her heart pounding in her chest. The officers immediately began a full sweep of the property, calling for backup, but Sarah already knew the truth. Whoever had been living in her house was gone now, slipping away into the night like a ghost. She would never see them again. But she would always wonder, every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the corner of her eye, if they were really gone, or if they were just waiting for the right moment to return. Thank you.